Fort Pulaski, the fortress that changed warfare forever. The rise of an invincible fortress. Just east of Savannah, Georgia, where the Savannah River empties into the Atlantic Ocean, stands one of America's most remarkable military fortifications. Today, Fort Pulaski appears peaceful. Visitors stroll along its brick walls, admire the surrounding marshlands, and watch ships pass through the same waterways that have been traveled for centuries. But more than 160 years ago, this quiet island was the stage for one of the most important military battles in American history, a battle that forever changed the science of warfare. Fort Pulaski wasn't simply defeated, it made an entire style of fortress obsolete. For decades, military engineers believed forts like Fort Pulaski could withstand almost any attack. Massive brick walls, some 7.5 feet thick, surrounded by moats and reinforced by millions of bricks, represented the pinnacle of defensive engineering. Experts believed the fort was virtually indestructible. Then, in April of 1862, everything changed. The siege of Fort Pulaski lasted only 30 hours, yet its consequences echoed around the world. To understand why we first have to travel back to the years following the War of 1812, the War of 1812 exposed serious weaknesses in America's coastal defenses. British forces had sailed almost unopposed into American waters, capturing cities and even burning Washington, D.C. in 1814. American leaders knew they could never allow that to happen again. In response, the United States launched one of the largest military construction projects in its history, known today as the Third System of Coastal Fortifications. This ambitious program called for dozens of massive masonry forts to protect the nation's most important harbors and waterways. These were not simple forts. They were engineering masterpieces. Among the men responsible for designing this defensive network was General Simon Bernard, a French military engineer who had once served under Napoleon Bonaparte himself. Bernard brought decades of European military experience to the young United States. His designs emphasized thick masonry walls, strategic placement of artillery, and carefully engineered defensive layouts that reflected the most advanced military thinking of the early 19th century. One of his greatest creations would rise on a small marsh island known as Cockspur Island. Its mission was straightforward: guard Savannah. Savannah was one of the South's most important ports. Ships carrying cotton, rice, naval stores, timber, and countless other goods entered and left through the Savannah River. Protecting this gateway meant protecting one of America's busiest commercial centers. Construction of the new fort officially began in 1829. What followed was nearly 2 decades of extraordinary labor. The project consumed approximately 25 million bricks. Workers hauled enormous quantities of granite, timber, iron, and other materials onto the isolated island, much of which had to be stabilized before construction could even begin. Engineers battled shifting marshes, flooding tides, mosquitoes, disease, and extreme summer heat. The sheer logistics of building such a massive fortress on a swampy island challenged everyone involved. When completed 18 years later, the cost exceeded $1 million, a staggering amount of money during the mid-1800s. The fort's walls rose approximately 2 feet above the surrounding moat. Inside were casemates, arched brick chambers that housed soldiers, stored supplies, and protected artillery crews from enemy fire. At full strength, Fort Pulaski could mount well over 100 cannons. The fort's commanding position allowed defenders to fire upon enemy vessels attempting to enter Savannah Harbor long before they could threaten the city itself. Military observers praised the fortress, and some even called it one of the strongest coastal defenses ever constructed in the United States. One admirer famously declared that attacking Fort Pulaski would be about as successful as bombarding the Rocky Mountains. Few people disagreed. The fort was named after Count Casimir Pulaski, a Polish nobleman and military commander who volunteered to fight alongside the American colonies during the Revolutionary War. Pulaski earned recognition as one of George Washington's most skilled cavalry commanders. His daring leadership helped shape the Continental Army's cavalry tactics, earning him the title Father of the American Cavalry. In 1779, during the Siege of Savannah, Pulaski was mortally wounded while leading a cavalry charge against British forces. He died shortly afterward aboard the ship USS Wasp. Naming the new fort after him honored both his sacrifice and his enduring contribution to American independence. Ironically, the fortress bearing his name would later become one of the defining battlefields of another American conflict. As the 1850s unfolded, political tensions between northern and southern states intensified, as arguments over slavery, states' rights, tariffs, and political power fractured the nation. Following Abraham Lincoln's election in November 1860, several southern states chose to secede from the Union. South Carolina was the first. Georgia followed on January 19, 1861. At that moment, Fort Pulaski remained a federal installation, although it had not yet been fully occupied by United States troops. Recognizing its strategic importance, Georgia Governor Joseph E. Brown wasted little time. On January 3, 1861, even before Georgia officially left the Union, he ordered state militia forces to seize Fort Pulaski. The takeover occurred without bloodshed. Confederate engineers immediately began strengthening the fort's defenses. Cannons were installed, supplies were stockpiled, additional troops arrived. The Confederacy believed Fort Pulaski would serve as the guardian of Savannah. They had every right and reason to be confident. Military doctrine at that time taught that smoothbore artillery, the standard cannons used throughout the world, could do little damage against heavy masonry at long distances. Experience suggested that beyond 700 yards, success was unlikely. Beyond 1,000 yards, it was considered virtually impossible. Adding to the defenders' confidence was geography. The nearest suitable ground for a siege lay more than a mile away on Tybee Island. No army had ever successfully destroyed a masonry fort from that distance. Among those convinced of the fort's security was Robert E. Lee. Years before becoming the Confederacy's most famous general, Lee had served as a young Army engineer stationed at Cockspur Island. He supervised drainage improvements and gained intimate knowledge of the fort's construction. When war began, Lee reportedly reassured Colonel Charles H. Olmsted, the Confederate commander at Fort Pulaski. Federal artillery positioned on Tybee Island, Lee believed could certainly make life uncomfortable. I quote, "They can make it pretty warm for you," he reportedly remarked, "but they cannot breach your walls." That belief reflected everything military science understood at that time. It also happened to be completely wrong. Meanwhile, events elsewhere dramatically shifted the strategic situation. President Abraham Lincoln ordered the United States Navy to blockade southern ports. Known as the Anaconda Plan, the blockade aimed to slowly strangle the Confederate economy by preventing cotton exports and restricting imports of weapons, ammunition, medicine, and manufactured goods. Savannah quickly became a major target. In November 1861, Union forces launched a combined Army and Navy expedition against Port Royal Sound in South Carolina, approximately 15 miles north of Fort Pulaski. The operation proved highly successful. Confederate defenders abandoned nearby positions as Union naval guns overwhelmed coastal defenses. Federal troops quickly established a secure base on Hilton Head Island. This victory dramatically altered the balance of power along the southeastern coast. Only days later, Confederate commanders made another critical decision. Concerned about the growing federal presence, they abandoned Tybee Island at the mouth of the Savannah River. At the time, the withdrawal appeared reasonable. In reality, it would prove catastrophic. Tybee Island offered the only practical location from which heavy siege artillery could target Fort Pulaski. By giving up the island without a fight, Confederate forces unknowingly handed Union engineers exactly what they needed: a launching point. The stage was now set for one of the most revolutionary military experiments ever attempted. The Union placed an ambitious young engineer in charge of the operation, Captain Quincy Adams Gilmore. Unlike many other officers, Gilmore embraced new technology. He believed recent improvements in artillery, particularly rifled cannons, have fundamentally changed warfare. Most military leaders remained skeptical. Gilmore intended to prove them wrong. Over the coming weeks, thousands of Union soldiers worked almost entirely at night, secretly transporting massive cannons, heavy mortars, ammunition, timber, and supplies across miles of marshland onto Tybee Island. The effort required extraordinary ingenuity. Men built roads through mud, constructed hidden gun batteries from sand and logs, and carefully concealed their work from Confederate observers inside Fort Pulaski. When the preparations were complete, 11 batteries containing 36 guns and mortars faced the supposedly invincible fortress. Among them were 10 experimental rifle cannons unlike anything else most soldiers had ever seen. These weapons would soon write a completely new chapter in military history. By the spring of 1862, everything was in place. Hidden behind sand dunes and maritime forests on Tybee Island, Union soldiers had spent weeks constructing one of the most ambitious siege operations ever attempted in North America. Working almost entirely under the cover of darkness, they hauled more than 36 heavy guns and mortars across nearly impossible terrain. Wagons became trapped in mud. Horses struggled through tidal marshes. Soldiers laid wooden roads over swamps and carried thousands of pounds of ammunition by hand. Confederate lookouts inside Fort Pulaski could occasionally hear unusual sounds drifting across the marsh. But from more than a mile away, they could see very little. Most believed the Federals were simply strengthening their position. Few imagined they were witnessing the birth of modern warfare. The centerpiece of the Union siege was not the number of guns, it was the type of guns. For centuries, artillery had changed very little. Cannons fired smooth, round iron balls from smoothbore barrels. These projectiles smashed against walls with tremendous force, but usually bounced or shattered harmlessly against thick masonry. The new rifle cannons were different. Inside their barrels were spiral grooves that caused elongated projectiles to spin as they traveled through the air, much like a modern football. This spin dramatically increased both accuracy and penetrating power. Instead of striking a wall with a blunt impact, the projectiles acted almost like enormous drills, boring deep into brick before exploding. Many military officers still questioned whether these experimental weapons would perform as advertised. Captain Quincy Gilmore had no doubts. On April 10, 1862, he sent Colonel Charles H. Olmsted a formal demand for surrender. Olmsted refused. Confident in Fort Pulaski's reputation and its massive walls, he declined to give up one of the Confederacy's strongest coastal defenses without a fight. At approximately 8:15 that morning, the silence ended. A single mortar shell arced into the sky. Moments later, another gun fired, then another. Within minutes, dozens of Union cannons erupted simultaneously. The siege of Fort Pulaski had begun. The first hours unfolded almost exactly as Confederate defenders expected. Heavy mortar shells burst overhead. Smoothbore cannonballs slammed harmlessly into the walls. The fort shook violently, but remained standing. From inside, many soldiers believed the bombardment would eventually exhaust itself. Then Gilmore gave the order that changed everything. His rifled cannons concentrated their fire on one specific section of the southeast angle of the fort. Instead of scattering shots across the walls, Union gunners repeatedly struck the same small area again and again and again. Each impact dug deeper. Bricks began flying outward in clouds of dust. The neat red walls that had stood proudly for years slowly transformed into piles of shattered masonry. Union artillery crews carefully adjusted their aim after every shot. Accuracy improved with each passing hour. The damage became impossible to ignore. By evening, large cracks stretched across the southeastern wall. Inside the fort, Confederate soldiers worked desperately to repair the damage. Under constant fire, they stacked sandbags, reinforced weakened sections with timber, and attempted to fill holes with loose bricks. Every repair disappeared beneath another barrage. Throughout the night, the bombardment continued. Neither side slept much. Union crews rotated fresh guns teams into position while Confederate defenders waited anxiously for dawn. Uncertain how much of the fort would still be standing, the following morning, April 11th, Gilmore resumed the attack. This time, the results came quickly. Within hours, an enormous breach opened in the southeastern angle. For the first time in military history, rifled artillery had successfully pierced the walls of a major masonry fortress from a distance previously considered impossible. But the greatest danger was yet to come. Just beyond the collapsing wall sat Fort Pulaski's main powder magazine. Thousands of pounds of black powder were stored there. If Union shells reached that magazine, the resulting explosion would almost kill hundreds of men instantly. Colonel Olmsted understood the situation perfectly. He walked the battered walls, inspecting the damage personally. Each passing minute increased the likelihood that another shell would ignite the powder supply. Continuing the fight would accomplish little beyond sacrificing his men. At approximately 2 o'clock that afternoon, after roughly 30 hours of bombardment, white flags appeared above Fort Pulaski. The firing stopped, the battle was over, the Confederates surrendered. A total of approximately 385 Confederate officers and enlisted men marched out of the fort as prisoners of war. Many expected humiliation. Instead, Union officers treated them with professional respect. Captain Quincy Gilmore reportedly complimented Colonel Olmsted on his determined defense. Olmsted returned the respect, acknowledging the extraordinary effectiveness of Gilmore's artillery. The two officers recognized that they had just witnessed history. Remarkably, few soldiers had been killed during the siege. Considering the intensity of the bombardment, casualties remained surprisingly light. The greatest victim had not been the garrison. It had been an entire philosophy of military engineering. News of Fort Pulaski's fall spread rapidly throughout the United States and Europe. Military observers were stunned. For generations, engineers had believed thick masonry walls represented the strongest possible defenses. Pulaski proved otherwise. If rifle artillery could destroy one of America's strongest forts from more than a mile away, then every similar fortress in the world suddenly faced the same vulnerability. One Union officer summarized the significance immediately after the battle. He wrote that the bombardment must cause a change in the construction of fortifications. He was absolutely correct. Around the world, military engineers abandoned traditional brick and stone forts. New defensive designs emphasize earthworks, reinforced concrete, lower profiles, and dispersed positions capable of absorbing artillery fire rather than resisting it with rigid walls. Fort Pulaski marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. Captain Quincy Gilmore's reputation soared. His innovative use of rifled artillery earned him promotion to brigadier general, and he would go on to command additional Union operations during the Civil War, including campaigns against Charleston. Colonel Charles H. Homestead was sent north as a prisoner of war to Governor's Island in New York Harbor. Later exchanged, he returned to Confederate service and continued serving with distinction until the war ended. His courage during the siege earned respect from both sides. Meanwhile, Fort Pulaski entered a new chapter. Union forces occupied the fort for the remainder of the Civil War. Its strategic location allowed federal troops to enforce the blockade of Savannah and maintain control over one of the Confederacy's most important waterways. The fort also became part of another significant chapter in American history. During the war, it housed Confederate prisoners, including civilians accused of supporting the rebellion. Later, it also imprisoned Confederate officers under difficult conditions in retaliation for Confederate treatment of captured Union soldiers elsewhere. These events reflected the increasingly harsh realities of a conflict that had become far more brutal than anyone imagined in 1861. When General William Sherman captured Savannah in December 1864 during his famous March to the Sea, Fort Pulaski had already secured Union control over the river. The city could no longer serve as an effective Confederate port. In many ways, the fall of the fort had helped pave the way of Savannah's eventual capture. Following the Civil War, the military importance of Fort Pulaski steadily declined. Technology continued advancing. Steel warships replaced wooden fleets. Explosive shells grew even more powerful. New coastal defense systems rendered old masonry forts increasingly obsolete. Eventually, only a caretaker and lighthouse keeper remained on Cockspur Island. Nature slowly reclaimed the once busy military installation. Grass pushed between bricks. Trees spread across abandoned parade grounds. Birds nested where soldiers once stood watch. Fortunately, Americans recognized the fort's historic importance before it disappeared. In 1924, Fort Pulaski was designated a national monument. A decade later, extensive restoration work began. The Civilian Conservation Corps, one of President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal programs, played a major role in preserving the fort during the Great Depression. Their efforts ensured future generations could experience this remarkable piece of American history. Today, visitors walking through Fort Pulaski can still see the scars left by Union artillery. Many of the damaged brick walls remain exactly where Gilmore's rifled projectile struck them more than 160 years ago. Those scars tell a story that extends far beyond the American Civil War. They represent one of history's greatest reminders that technological innovation can overturn even the strongest assumptions. Military experts once believed Fort Pulaski was practically invincible. Its designs had incorporated the finest engineering knowledge of their generation. Its defenders trusted its walls. Its reputation inspired confidence throughout the nation. Yet in just 30 hours, a handful of experimental weapons proved that decades of accepted military wisdom had become outdated. Fort Pulaski did not merely surrender, it transformed warfare. Today, as visitors stand atop its walls overlooking the marshes of coastal Georgia, they see far more than an old brick fort. They stand at the place where one age of military history ended and another began. The red brick walls remain. The moat still surrounds the fortress. The Savannah River continues flowing toward the Atlantic, just as it did centuries ago. But every crack in those walls serves as a permanent reminder that no technology remains supreme forever. Innovation changes everything, and sometimes it only takes 30 hours to change the world. And that is why its story still deserves to be told. Knowledge is power.
Can I let it die down? I remember days in the trench. Time to go hard then, time to go all in. Time to get my all to this shit. Panamera maxed out, first class flights out Atlantic to Pacific, yeah, it's lit.